Hi, I'm Stacey Hyde, and I'm back for another episode of Better Financial Health in 15 minutes or less. And what I'd like to talk about today is benchmarks. What's a benchmark? A benchmark is something that you're comparing. In the case I'm talking about, you're comparing your portfolio to. It's a way to check to see, how am I doing? Am I doing as well as I should be? Is there something I should be watching out for? I think one thing to note is that you want to be careful about, one, what benchmark you're choosing, and also what time period, because it's often been said that markets are rational and they are taking in all information. And yes, while that's true, in very short periods of time, markets can act like your drunk uncle. Make no sense. Stocks jump up in value because maybe they've become popular on Reddit. We saw that a lot during the pandemic. GameStop is a sort of the poster child for that. But when you're looking at your overall portfolio, the benchmark that you want to choose depends on what is the use for that portfolio. Most of us have several different accounts. We may have savings accounts, we may have retirement accounts, we may have a Roth IRA, we may have an individual or a joint account with a partner or spouse. And each of those may be tied to different goals or different aspirations. For example, money in a savings account is generally there to help for emergencies, meaning that we have unexpected expenses. Perhaps you've got to replace your AC system. It's summertime, so it's pretty hot these days. Or it could be something that is longer term. Maybe you've opened a 529 plan for your newborn child and you're saving for their college education. Well, that's 16, 18 years away, so you can afford to be more aggressive. Same thing with your retirement. If that's 20 plus years away, you can afford to be aggressive. And yes, markets are going to go up and down over that time, but really, if you have a broadly diversified, I'll come back to that in a second, portfolio, then you don't really need to worry about it if it goes down and you look and the market as a whole is going down. That's not to say that you should never look at your portfolio. And if you look and you've got one fund that or ETF that's not doing well, well, you may need to change that. But make sure that you're comparing the performance against other funds of that type. For example, small company stocks up until a couple of weeks ago were massively underperforming their large cap brethren. But if your small cap fund was doing like all other small cap funds and it had a low expense ratio and was tax efficient if it's in a taxable account, then you just want to leave it alone and just say, well, right now small caps are out of favor, but I'm still going to hold that because it's important to have that exposure. So that's what I mean by appropriate benchmarks. And if you're saving for something that's shorter term in nature, say you're saving up for a house down payment or you need a new car, that money should also be pretty safe and probably not best suited for the stock market. But it's also important to understand just how concentrated some what we would consider broad stock market benchmarks are. For example, the S&P 500, it's 500 stocks, right? So it's got to be diversified. It owns 500 stocks. But one thing to keep in mind about those types of investments, they can also get pretty concentrated because the S&P 500 is what is known as a capitalization weighted index. So the larger companies in that 500 represent a larger share of that index. To give you an idea, last week I had a client pose the question about why his portfolio was not performing as well as the S&P 500, and part of that dealt with the S&P 500 has 30% of the portfolio in 6 stocks. 6 out of 500, 6 make up 30%. So you've got 494 stocks that are making up the rest of the 70%. So that's getting very, very concentrated. And that, from a risk standpoint, that may not be what you want. Now, you're certainly going to have exposure to Nvidia, to Microsoft, to Google, aka Alphabet, Meta slash Facebook, Amazon. Those are all great companies. But if you look at it and you say, okay, yes, those stocks have done extraordinarily well, but in order to keep growing at that rate, is that really possible? Just given the law of large numbers, and also the pushback of some of the EU and in the US, antitrust concerns, concerns about if they're, Nvidia in particular, as more companies start competing with them in this AI world, is that going to cut into their profit margins? History says yes, that's likely to be the case, but then you have a company like Microsoft that's been around since really the dawn of the personal computer, and they have continually reinvented themselves and stayed incredibly valuable. The same can be said of Apple and a lot of the others. So it's not to say that you don't want to own those. You just want to make sure that you also own some smaller companies, some international. One thing you may not realize is a lot of our health and drug companies are actually European countries. So if you're saying, I'm only going to invest in the US, you're also leaving out a lot of healthcare and cutting edge type healthcare, as well as car companies and other companies along that you may actually want exposure to. And it's also important to mention that in today's environment, with interest rates being higher, owning fixed income actually gives you some nice returns and can offset downturns in the stock market. So it's important to pay attention to how you're judging your portfolio, to not make snap decisions, to look at it thoughtfully. And it may be time, if you've got a high expense fund that is underperforming, maybe it's a good time to get rid of that one and replace it with something that is lower cost, in a taxable account, more efficient, and go from there. But make sure that you are comparing apples to apples, and be calm as you look at it, and really look at it on the whole. So yes, looking at performance is important. It is a scorecard, but you also don't want to do it too often, because study after study has shown that people who look at their portfolio too often get caught up in it and they peg it, and it can cause them to make bad overall decisions. So you want to be thoughtful, pay attention, but not too much attention. Maybe every 6 months, once a year, take a look at it, see if you need to do anything with it. Other than that, live your life. If you're feeling stressed, a lot of studies show that getting out in nature, take the AirPods out and just be in nature and experience it. That can help you overcome and keep your focus on the main things, which is, what am I trying to do in the real world with real people? And going about it that way, I think you'll feel much better. Thanks so much for tuning in. This has been another episode of Better Financial Health in 15 Minutes or Less.